The morning I found the neon orange violation notice stapled to my fence post, I was carrying a bucket of feed out to the alpacas, and honestly thought it was some kind of joke. The paper fluttered in the cold March wind coming off the front range, and I had to squint against the early Colorado sun to read the bold letters screaming about livestock violations and immediate removal requirements. My name, Vincent Sterling, was spelled correctly at least, but everything else about the document made my blood pressure spike before I'd even had my second cup of coffee. I stood there in my work boots, the feed bucket growing heavy in my hand, watching my 6 alpacas grazing peacefully in their pasture. Rembrandt, my lead male, lifted his elegant neck to look at me with those impossibly long, lashed eyes, probably wondering why I hadn't brought breakfast over yet. The others, Picasso, Monet, Van Gogh, Frida, and Georgia, continued munching on the hay I'd put out earlier, completely unaware that according to the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, they were now considered illegal occupants of my 5-acre property. I'd moved to this development outside of Fort Collins 2 years ago, specifically because the lots were large enough for agricultural use. The real estate agent had been crystal clear about that. I'd done my research, checked the county zoning, verified everything twice before I bought the place, and invested $30,000 into fencing, a barn, and the alpacas themselves. My fiber farm wasn't just a hobby. It was a legitimate business with an LLC, a tax ID number, and clients across 3 states who paid premium prices for the luxury fiber my animals produced. The violation notice gave me 72 hours to remove all livestock from the property or face daily fines of $200. It was signed by someone named Deborah Patterson, HOA president, with a phone number listed at the bottom. I pulled out my phone and dialed immediately, not caring that it was barely 7 in the morning. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, her voice sharp and suspicious. Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, Deborah Patterson speaking. This is Vincent Sterling from 4782 Mountain Vista Drive. I just found a violation notice on my property about my alpacas. There must be some mistake. No mistake, Mr. Sterling. We've received multiple complaints about your livestock operation. The CC&Rs clearly state that no farm animals are permitted on residential properties within Meadowbrook Estates. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Mrs. Patterson, I reviewed the CC&Rs thoroughly before I purchased this property. There's nothing in there prohibiting agricultural use on lots over 2 acres. My property is 5 acres, properly zoned agricultural by Larimer County, and I operate a licensed fiber farm business. The CC&Rs prohibit farm animals. Mr. Sterling, that's quite clear. Can you tell me specifically which section states that? Because I have my copy right here and I've never seen any such restriction. There was a pause, and I heard papers rustling. It's implied in the section about maintaining property values and preventing nuisances. Farm animals are clearly a nuisance. Implied isn't the same as stated, Mrs. Patterson, and alpacas aren't a nuisance. They're quieter than dogs, cleaner than most pets, and my operation is completely legal under both county and state regulations. I'm not going to argue with you, Mr. Sterling. The board has voted, and the violation stands. You have 72 hours to remove the animals, or fines will begin accruing. Good day. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there staring at my phone, feeling the anger building in my chest. This wasn't right. I'd done everything by the book, and now some power-hungry HOA president was trying to shut down my business based on nothing but her own interpretation of vague language. I went inside and dug out my closing documents from the filing cabinet in my home office. The CC&Rs were over 60 pages long, and I'd read them multiple times before making an offer on the property. I went through them again now, page by page, looking for anything that could be construed as prohibiting my alpaca farm. The only section that came close was Article 7, Section 3, which stated that owners must maintain their properties in a manner that preserved neighborhood character and property values, and that no activities creating excessive noise, odors, or visual blight would be permitted. Nothing about farm animals, nothing about livestock, nothing specifically prohibiting agricultural operations on properly zoned land. I called my real estate attorney, Gerald Morrison, and left a message explaining the situation. Then I called my neighbor to the east, Tim Rodriguez, who'd always been friendly and had even come over to meet the alpacas when I first brought them home. "Tim, it's Vincent. Have you complained to the HOA about my alpacas?" "What?" "No, man. Why would I complain? I think they're great. My kids love seeing them when we drive by. The HOA just hit me with a violation notice saying I have to remove them in 3 days. They claim there have been multiple complaints." "That's crazy. I haven't heard anybody complaining. You want me to ask around?" "Yeah, that would help. I'm trying to figure out where this is even coming from. I made similar calls to my other immediate neighbors. The Johnsons to the west hadn't complained. The Fernandez family to the south actually bought fiber from me every year for their wife's spinning hobby. Nobody I talked to had any issue with the alpacas, and several people expressed surprise that the HOA was involved at all." Gerald called me back around 10 that morning. "Vincent, I've reviewed your documents. You're on solid legal ground here. The property is properly zoned for agricultural use, your business is licensed, and there's nothing in the CC&Rs that specifically prohibits what you're doing. The HOA is overreaching." "So what do? They're threatening daily fines." "Ignore the fines for now. They can't enforce them without going through the proper legal process, and they won't win if they try. But I'd recommend you attend the next HOA board meeting and address this directly." "When is it?" I checked the community website. "Next Thursday, the 21st. "Perfect. That gives us time to prepare. In the meantime, I'm going to send the HOA board a letter explaining your legal position and the relevant statutes that protect your right to operate an agricultural business on properly zoned land. Colorado has strong right-to-farm laws that will support your case. I felt slightly better after hanging up with Gerald, but the anxiety lingered. I'd built something good here, and the thought of being forced to give it up because of an overreaching HOA made me feel sick. The alpacas weren't just animals to me. They were my livelihood, my passion, and honestly, they'd been my salvation after my divorce 3 years ago. Coming home to their gentle presence, working with my hands, building a business from the ground up, had given me purpose when I'd felt lost. The 72-hour deadline came and went. I didn't remove the alpacas, and Friday morning brought another notice, this time informing me that I was being fined $200 per day until compliance was achieved. The notice was again signed by Deborah Patterson, and this time it included a threat of legal action if I didn't respond appropriately. Gerald's letter went out that afternoon, a detailed 3-page explanation of why the HOA's actions were illegal and a demand that they rescind the violations and fines immediately. He cited Colorado Revised Statutes, Title 35, Article 3.5, which established the right to farm on properly zoned agricultural land, and pointed out that the county zoning superseded HOA restrictions when it came to lawful agricultural operations. The response came Monday morning, not from Deborah Patterson, but from an attorney named Richard Caldwell, representing the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. His letter was dismissive and condescending, claiming that HOA covenants took precedence over county zoning in matters of property use restrictions, and that my agricultural operation violated the spirit and intent of the community standards. He demanded immediate compliance and informed me that the daily fines would continue to accrue. "This is ridiculous," I told Gerald when I forwarded him the letter. "They're just making stuff up now. They're wrong, but they're not going to back down easily. HOA boards sometimes get it in their heads that they're above the law. We'll address this at the meeting Thursday. In the meantime, document everything. Take photos, keep records of your business operations, gather any statements from neighbors supporting you." I spent the next few days doing exactly that. I photographed the alpacas in their clean, well-maintained pasture. I documented my barn, my storage areas, my processing room where I skirted and sorted the fiber after shearing. I compiled financial records showing my business income, my client list, my business license, and my agricultural tax exemption. I asked 6 different neighbors to write brief statements confirming that the alpacas caused no noise, odor, or other nuisance issues. Thursday evening, I drove to the community center where the HOA meetings were held, my stomach tight with nervous energy. Gerald met me in the parking lot, carrying a leather briefcase full of documents. "Remember, stay calm no matter what they say. Let me do most of the talking. We're presenting facts and law, not getting into an emotional argument." The meeting room was set up with a long table at the front for the board members and rows of folding chairs for residents. About 30 people were scattered throughout the seats, which was apparently a large turnout for a typical HOA meeting. I recognized several of my neighbors who'd promised to come in support. Deborah Patterson sat at the center of the board table, and I got my first good look at the woman who'd been causing me so much trouble. She was probably in her mid-50s, with short blonde hair styled in that speak-to-the-manager cut that had become a meme. She wore a navy blue blazer and a pearl necklace, and her expression as she looked at me was one of pure disdain. 2 other board members flanked her, a nervous-looking younger man who kept adjusting his glasses, and an older woman who appeared to be reading something on her phone. The meeting started with standard business, approval of the previous minutes, a treasurer's report, discussion of some landscaping issues near the community entrance. I sat through it all, my leg bouncing with barely contained tension. Finally, Deborah's voice rang out. "New business. We need to address the ongoing violation at 4782 Mountain Vista Drive, where Mr. Sterling continues to maintain illegal livestock in defiance of our community standards." Gerald stood smoothly. "Madam President, if I may address the board, I'm Gerald Morrison, attorney for Mr. Sterling. We're here tonight to resolve what I believe is a significant misunderstanding regarding my client's property rights." Deborah's expression hardened. "There's no misunderstanding. The violation is clear." "With respect, there is no violation. Mr. Sterling's property is zoned for agricultural use by Larimer County. He operates a licensed fiber farm business. The alpacas on his property are part of a legitimate agricultural operation protected by Colorado's right to farm statutes. The HOA's CC and Rs contain no specific prohibition against agricultural use on properly zoned lots over 2 acres. The board's attorney, Richard Caldwell, stood from his seat in the front row. "The CC and Rs clearly empower the board to enforce community standards and prevent nuisances. Farm animals in a residential development are inherently a nuisance." "That's an opinion, not a legal standard," Gerald countered. "The law requires actual evidence of nuisance, not speculation. Mr. Sterling has statements from 6 neighbors confirming that his alpacas create no noise, odor, or other disturbance. The animals are contained on his 5-acre property, properly cared for, and part of a profitable business operation. Colorado law specifically protects the right to engage in agricultural activities on agricultural land, even within areas that have residential development." I watched the board members as Gerald spoke. The young man with glasses looked uncertain, glancing between Gerald and Deborah. The older woman had put down her phone and was actually paying attention now. But Deborah's expression remained fixed in stubborn disapproval. "This is a residential community," she said, her voice sharp. "When people buy homes here, they expect a certain quality of life. They don't expect to live next to a farm. The board has the authority to interpret the CC and RS in a way that protects all residents." I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Mrs. Patterson, my neighbors don't have a problem with the alpacas. Nobody who actually lives near me has complained. Who exactly are you protecting?" Her eyes locked on mine. "I've received complaints, Mr. Sterling. I don't have to disclose who made them." "Because they don't exist," I said, my voice rising despite Gerald's warning hand on my arm. "You just don't like alpacas on principle, and you're abusing your position to force your personal preferences on everyone else." "That's enough," Deborah snapped. "The board has made its decision. The violation stands, and fines will continue to accrue until you comply." Gerald stepped forward. "Mrs. Patterson, members of the board, I want to be very clear about something. If you continue with these violations and fines, you will be exposing the HOA to significant legal liability. My client is operating well within his legal rights. If he's forced to take legal action to protect those rights, he will win, and the HOA will be responsible not only for his attorney's fees, but also for any damages he suffers as a result of your illegal interference with his business operations. I strongly encourage you to consult with your attorney about the actual law here before proceeding further." Richard Caldwell rose again. "We're confident in our legal position, and we're prepared to defend the community's interests in court if necessary." The meeting devolved from there, with several residents speaking up either to support me or to voice general confusion about why this was even an issue. One woman in the back actually stood up and said she'd specifically come to Meadowbrook Estates because of the larger lots and agricultural character, and she thought the HOA was making a mistake. But Deborah shut down the discussion, called for a vote to uphold the violation, and got support from herself and the older woman on the board. The young man with glasses abstained, which seemed to irritate Deborah immensely. We left the meeting with nothing resolved. Gerald looked frustrated, but not defeated. Okay, so they want to do this the hard way. We'll file an injunction to stop the fines and start the process of suing for damages. You said you have clients waiting on fiber shipments? Yeah, I usually shear in April and have orders totaling about $15,000 for this year's fiber. If they force me to move the alpacas or somehow interfere with my operation, I'll miss the optimal shearing window and disappoint clients who've been buying from me for years. Document all of that. We're going to need to show concrete damages from their actions. Over the next 2 weeks, things got worse. The HOA started sending daily violation notices, each one stamping another $200 fine onto my supposed debt. I received a certified letter informing me that my account was delinquent and threatening to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay the accumulated fines, which now totaled over $3,000. Gerald filed our lawsuit in Larimer County District Court, seeking an injunction against the HOA's enforcement actions and damages for interference with my business operations. The complaint was comprehensive, citing violations of my property rights, Colorado's right to farm laws, and improper interpretation and application of the CC&Rs. But before we even got a hearing date on the injunction, Deborah Patterson escalated the situation in a way I never anticipated. I came home from grocery shopping on a Tuesday afternoon to find a Larimer County animal control truck parked in my driveway and 2 officers walking my property with clipboards. My heart dropped into my stomach. I parked quickly and jumped out. What's going on? Is there a problem? A middle-aged officer with graying hair turned to me. Are you the property owner? Yes, Vincent Sterling. What's happening? We received a report of animal neglect and improper housing conditions. We're here to inspect the premises and evaluate the welfare of the animals. Neglect? That's insane. My alpacas are perfectly cared for. Who reported this? Anonymous complaint called in this morning. I felt the anger burning through my chest. This is harassment. The HOA is making false reports because they want me to get rid of the alpacas. The officer's expression remained neutral and professional. We have to respond to all complaints, sir. If everything's in order, you have nothing to worry about. Can you show us where the animals are kept? I spent the next hour walking the officers through my entire operation. They inspected the barn, the pasture, the water sources, the feed storage. They examined each alpaca individually, checking body condition, hoof health, and coat quality. They took photos and made notes on their clipboards. Through it all, I answered every question honestly while trying to contain my rage at the situation. Finally, the lead officer turned to me. Mr. Sterling, I'm going to be straight with you. These animals are in excellent condition. Your facilities exceed the standards we'd normally look for. There's no neglect here, no improper housing, nothing that raises any concern from an animal welfare perspective. Relief flooded through me. Thank you. So that's it? We'll file our report stating we found no violations. If we get another complaint, we'll have to respond. But this report will be on file showing the conditions we observed today. He paused, his expression sympathetic. Off the record, it sounds like you've got an HOA problem, not an animal welfare problem. You might want to talk to a lawyer. I already have one. We're in court right now. After they left, I immediately called Gerald and told him what happened. He was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was tight with controlled anger. They filed a false report with animal control. That's potentially criminal, depending on what was said in the complaint. I'm going to request a copy of that report through discovery, and if we can prove it was Deborah Patterson or another board member who made the call, we're adding malicious prosecution and harassment to the lawsuit. Can we also get this documented somehow? I want a record that this happened right after the HOA meeting. Absolutely. I'll subpoena the animal control records and include this incident in our amended complaint. This actually helps our case because it shows the pattern of harassment. The injunction hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, in mid-April. In the meantime, I continued caring for my alpacas, running my business, and watching my property like a hawk for any further interference. I installed security cameras covering all approaches to my barn and pasture, and I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with the HOA. 2 more anonymous complaints came in, one to animal control again, and another to the county zoning office claiming I was running a commercial farm operation in violation of residential zoning. Both agencies investigated, and both times they found my operation completely compliant with all regulations. The animal control officer who came out the second time actually rolled his eyes when he saw my address on the complaint. "Mr. Sterling, right? Look, I'm documenting that this is the 3rd complaint we've received about your property in as many weeks, and all 3 times we've found nothing wrong. If someone keeps calling in false reports, they could be charged with misuse of emergency services. You might want to mention that to whoever's doing this." The zoning inspector was less sympathetic, but equally clear. "Your agricultural exemption is legitimate, your business license is current, and you're operating well within the allowable parameters for a 5-acre agricultural lot. I don't know who keeps reporting you, but they're wasting everybody's time." Gerald added all of these incidents to our growing case file. Our lawsuit was getting stronger by the day, but the stress was taking its toll. I wasn't sleeping well, and the constant state of defensive alertness was exhausting. Every time a car slowed down near my property, I tensed up wondering what was coming next. The morning of the injunction hearing, I put on my only suit and met Gerald at the courthouse. We'd prepared extensively, organizing all our evidence into clear exhibits: the county zoning documents, my business records, the CC&Rs with the relevant sections highlighted, the neighbor statements, the animal control reports, the documentation of every violation notice and fine the HOA had issued. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, just a simple room with the judge's bench at the front and tables for the parties. Deborah Patterson was there with Richard Caldwell and another woman I didn't recognize, who turned out to be the HOA's corporate representative. They sat at one table looking confident and self-righteous. Gerald and I took the other table. Judge Margaret Chen entered and we all rose. She was in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that suggested she didn't tolerate nonsense in her courtroom. After we sat, she reviewed the case file briefly, then looked up at both parties. "This is a hearing on the plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction to stop the defendant HOA from imposing fines and violations related to the plaintiff's alpaca operation. Mr. Morrison, you may proceed." Gerald stood and presented our case methodically. He walked Judge Chen through the zoning documentation, proving my property was legal for agricultural use. He presented the CC&Rs and pointed out the complete absence of any specific prohibition on agricultural operations. He cited the Colorado right to farm statutes and explained how they protected agricultural operations from nuisance claims by neighbors, which should extend to HOA actions as well. Then he moved into the harassment evidence. "Your Honor, what started as an improper interpretation of the CC&Rs has escalated into a pattern of harassment against my client. After Mr. Sterling refused to comply with the illegal violation notices, the HOA or someone connected to it began filing false reports with animal control and county zoning. We have documentation of 3 separate anonymous complaints, all of which resulted in inspections that found no violations whatsoever. My client has installed security cameras on his property because he's concerned about what the HOA might do next. This goes far beyond a simple dispute over covenant interpretation." Judge Chen made notes as Gerald spoke, her expression neutral but focused. When he finished, she turned to Richard Caldwell. "Mr. Caldwell, what's your position?" Caldwell stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, the HOA has a duty to all residents to maintain community standards and property values. While Mr. Sterling's property may be zoned for agricultural use, he purchased within a residential development with established covenants. Those covenants give the board discretion to determine what activities are appropriate and consistent with the character of the neighborhood. The board determined that a livestock operation, regardless of the specific animals involved, is inconsistent with that character. The right to farm statutes don't override private covenants, and the board acted within its authority. What about the specific language of the CC and RS? Judge Chen asked. I've reviewed them. I don't see a prohibition on agricultural use. The prohibition is implicit in the general standards regarding property maintenance and nuisance prevention. Farm animals inherently create risks of odor, noise, and aesthetic concerns that impact neighboring properties. Do you have evidence of actual impacts? The plaintiff has provided statements from 6 neighbors saying the alpacas cause no problems. Caldwell hesitated slightly. We've received complaints from residents, Your Honor. How many, and what were the specific complaints? I don't have the exact number, but the board president has indicated multiple concerns were raised. Judge Chen looked at Deborah Patterson. Mrs. Patterson, how many complaints did you receive, and what were they about? Deborah stood stiffly. Several residents contacted me expressing concern about the impact on property values and the precedent it sets for other properties. That's not what I asked. How many specific complaints about noise, odor, or other direct impacts from these alpacas? There was a pause. The concerns were more about the general principle, Your Honor. So no actual complaints about the alpacas themselves causing problems? Not specifically about those issues, no. Judge Chen leaned back in her chair, and I could see the decision forming in her expression. Here's what I'm seeing. Mr. Sterling owns property that is legally zoned for agricultural use. He operates a licensed business that has passed every inspection by relevant authorities. The HOA's covenants don't contain specific language prohibiting his activities. The neighboring property owners have stated they have no issues with his operation. The only party with a problem appears to be the HOA board itself, based on subjective opinions about what's appropriate for the neighborhood. She paused, looking directly at Deborah. Mrs. Patterson, HOA boards have authority, but that authority isn't unlimited. You can't simply decide you don't like something and use vague covenant language to prohibit it when the property owner is acting within their legal rights. The right to farm statutes exists specifically to prevent this kind of interference with legitimate agricultural operations. Caldwell started to object, but Judge Chen held up a hand. I'm granting the preliminary injunction. The HOA is ordered to immediately cease all enforcement actions related to Mr. Sterling's alpaca operation, including violations, fines, and any threats of liens or other penalties. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to rescind all fines that have been imposed and remove any record of violations from Mr. Sterling's account. Relief washed over me so powerfully I felt dizzy. Gerald's hand gripped my shoulder. Judge Chen wasn't finished. I'm also putting the HOA on notice that if there's any evidence that board members or HOA representatives were responsible for the false reports to animal control and zoning, that could constitute harassment and potentially criminal misconduct. I'm ordering the HOA to preserve all records related to any complaints or reports made about Mr. Sterling's property for potential further proceedings. This matter will proceed to trial on the underlying issues. But in the meantime, Mr. Sterling is free to operate his business without interference. Do both parties understand? We both affirmed that we did. The hearing was over in less than an hour, and Gerald and I walked out of the courthouse into the bright April sunshine feeling victorious. That went about as well as we could have hoped, Gerald said. Judge Chen saw right through their nonsense. What happens next? They'll probably want to settle before we get to trial, with the judge already signaling that she thinks they're wrong, and with the potential exposure on the harassment claims, their insurance company is going to push them to make this go away. We'll see what kind of offer they make. We didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, Richard Caldwell contacted Gerald to discuss settlement terms. The HOA was willing to permanently drop all violations and fines, issue a formal clarification that agricultural operations were permitted on properly zoned lots over 2 acres, and pay my attorney's fees. Not enough, I told Gerald. They've cost me business stress, time, and they've damaged my reputation in the community. I want compensation for damages. Gerald nodded. I agree. Let me counter with a demand for $20,000 in damages, plus attorney's fees, plus the policy clarification, plus a formal written apology from the board. The negotiations went back and forth for 2 weeks. The HOA tried to minimize the damages, offering $5,000. We came down to $15,000, but held firm on the attorney's fees and policy clarification. Eventually, they agreed to $12,000 in damages, full attorney's fees, which totaled about $8,000, the policy clarification, and a letter to all residents explaining that agricultural operations were permitted under the covenants on properly zoned lots. But I wasn't satisfied with just the settlement terms. What about the false reports to animal control? Someone did that deliberately to harass me. Gerald had been working on that angle separately. I've subpoenaed the records from animal control. The first complaint came from a cell phone number that, according to our investigator, belongs to Deborah Patterson's husband, Gary. The second call came from the HOA office phone. The third was from another board member, Susan Whitmore. So we can prove they made false reports? We can prove they made the calls. Whether the reports were intentionally false or based on a good faith belief that something was wrong is harder to establish, but it's enough to make them very nervous. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to push for criminal charges, to make them face real consequences for what they'd put me through. But another part just wanted this to be over so I could get back to my life and my business. Add another condition to the settlement, I said. Deborah Patterson resigns from the board. Gerald raised his eyebrows. That's going to be a tough sell. Then we go to trial and expose everything they did, including the false reports. Let the rest of the community see what kind of person is running their HOA. Gerald made the demand. Caldwell called it outrageous and said his client would never agree. Gerald reminded him that we had evidence of false reports made by board members and the HOA president's spouse, and that we'd be presenting all of it at trial, along with testimony about the pattern of harassment. He also pointed out that other residents might be very interested to learn how their HOA dues were being spent on a personal vendetta by the board president. It took another week, but eventually they capitulated. The final settlement agreement included all the monetary terms, the policy clarification, and a provision that Deborah Patterson would step down as HOA president and not seek re-election to the board. The agreement would be presented to the full board for approval at the next meeting, and assuming it passed, the lawsuit would be dismissed with prejudice. I attended that board meeting with Gerald, and this time the room was packed. Word had gotten out about the settlement, and residents were curious about what had happened. Deborah sat at the board table looking like she'd been chewing nails, her face tight and angry. The young man with glasses, whose name I'd learned was Marcus Foster, sat beside her looking relieved. Susan Whitmore, the older woman, avoided making eye contact with anyone. Marcus, acting as vice president, presented the settlement terms to the assembled residents. He explained that the board had received legal advice that the HOA's position was unlikely to prevail at trial, and that settling was the fiscally responsible choice to avoid potentially larger damages and attorney's fees. A woman in the third row raised her hand. I want to understand something. We're paying this settlement plus attorney's fees for both sides out of our HOA dues. How much is this costing the association? Marcus consulted his notes. The total cost, including our legal fees, the settlement payment, and the plaintiff's attorney's fees, is approximately $32,000. Murmurs of shock rippled through the room. A man near the back stood up. $32,000 because Deborah didn't like alpacas? Are you kidding me? Deborah's face flushed. This was a matter of principle. We have to protect property values and community standards. What property values? Another woman called out. I live 2 houses down from Mr. Sterling. Those alpacas are adorable and they don't bother anyone. You wasted our money on a power trip. The meeting devolved into chaos, with multiple residents shouting questions and complaints at the board. Marcus tried to maintain order, but it was clear the board had lost any credibility with the community. Several people called for Deborah's resignation, not knowing it was already part of the settlement. Finally, Marcus held up his hands for quiet. Everyone, please. I need to inform you that as part of the settlement agreement, Mrs. Patterson has agreed to resign as president and will not seek re-election to the board. I'll be assuming the role of president for the remainder of the term. That announcement brought a mixture of relief and continued anger from the assembled residents. The vote on the settlement was called, and it passed with only Susan Whitmore voting against. Deborah abstained, staring straight ahead with her jaw clenched. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to shake my hand and apologize for what the board had put me through. Tim Rodriguez clapped me on the back. "Man, I'm glad you fought this. Someone needed to stand up to that woman." Mrs. Fernandez, who bought my fiber for spinning, gave me a hug. "I was so worried you'd have to leave. The Alpacas are wonderful, and you're a good neighbor." Even Marcus Foster approached me privately. "Mr. Sterling, I want to apologize for not standing up to Deborah sooner. I knew she was wrong, but I was intimidated by her. I'm glad you won." "Why did she even target me?" I asked. "Did I do something to offend her?" Marcus glanced around to make sure no one was listening. "Honestly, she bought into the development thinking it would be more exclusive, more controlled. When she saw agricultural properties selling, especially to younger buyers like you, she felt like the neighborhood wasn't what she'd signed up for. She made it her mission to fight anything she saw as lowering the tone of the place. Your alpacas were just the most visible target." The settlement check came through 2 weeks later. $12,000 in damages, plus Gerald's fees paid separately by the HOA's insurance company. I used part of the money to upgrade my barn with better ventilation and lighting, and I put the rest into a business expansion fund. I'd been considering buying 2 more alpacas to increase my fiber production, and now I could do it without worrying about the cost. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the principle of the thing. I'd stood up for my rights against an organization that thought it could bully me into submission, and I'd won. The new board, led by Marcus, was focused on actual community issues rather than personal vendettas, and the revised policy clarification meant that other residents could pursue agricultural interests without fear of harassment. My spring shearing went off without a hitch. I brought in a professional shearer, and we processed all 6 alpacas in one long day. The fiber quality was excellent, and I was able to fulfill all my client orders on time. Several customers placed larger orders for the following year, and I picked up 3 new clients through word of mouth from my existing customers who'd heard about my legal battle and wanted to support my business. One afternoon in early May, I was out in the pasture checking the fence line when I saw a car pull into my driveway. My muscles tensed instinctively, residual wariness from months of conflict. But when the driver got out, I recognized Marcus Foster. He walked over to the fence, looking uncertain. "Hey, Vincent, got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "I wanted to update you on something. Deborah Patterson put her house on the market last week. She and her husband are moving out of the development." I felt a small surge of satisfaction at that news. "Can't say I'm sorry to see her go." "Yeah, well, there's more. After word got around about what happened with you and the HOA, 3 other board members got voted out at our annual election. We've got a completely new board now, and people are demanding better oversight of how decisions get made. It's actually been really positive for the community." "That's good to hear." Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching the alpacas grazing. "You know, I've been thinking about getting some chickens. My wife wants fresh eggs, and we've got that half-acre lot. The new policy clarification says poultry is allowed on lots over a quarter acre, right?" I smiled. "That's right. You should do it. Chickens are easy to care for, and fresh eggs really are better. Maybe you could give me some advice on setting up a coop." "Anytime." He left a few minutes later, and I stayed in the pasture with my alpacas, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The evening sun was painting the mountains to the west in shades of orange and purple, and the air had that clean, crisp quality that made Colorado spring so perfect. Rembrandt came over to the fence and nuzzled my hand, his soft nose warm against my palm. This was what I'd fought for. Not just the right to keep my alpacas or run my business, but the freedom to live on my own property according to my own values, as long as I wasn't harming anyone else. It seemed like such a basic principle, but apparently it was something worth fighting for. The final piece of closure came in July when I received a formal letter from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA, signed by Marcus as president. It was brief and to the point, stating that all violations and fines previously issued to my property had been permanently removed from the records, that the HOA acknowledged my right to operate my fiber farm under the covenants and applicable laws, and that they regretted any inconvenience or distress caused by the previous board's actions. It wasn't exactly a groveling apology. but it was official recognition that I'd been right all along. I filed it with my other legal documents and closed that chapter of my life. Business continued to grow. By the end of summer, I'd added those 2 new alpacas, a beautiful cream-colored female I named Maya, and a stunning silver-gray male I called Jasper. My client base had expanded to include several high-end yarn companies who were featuring my fiber in their luxury blends. I was on track to double my previous year's income, and I'd started teaching occasional workshops on alpaca husbandry and fiber processing. The neighborhood itself felt different too, more relaxed, more genuinely friendly. Without Deborah Patterson's hostile energy-driving division, people seemed more willing to embrace the agricultural character that had originally attracted many of us to Meadowbrook Estates. Tim Rodriguez got those chickens he mentioned, and another neighbor started a small vegetable stand at the end of his driveway, selling produce from his garden. The community was evolving into what it should have been all along, a place where people could pursue their interests and livelihoods without arbitrary interference. One Saturday morning in late August, I was hosing out the water troughs when a minivan pulled up and a family got out. The parents looked to be in their 30s, and they had 2 young kids bouncing with excitement. The father approached the fence. "Hi, are you Vincent Sterling?" "That's me." "I'm Jason Martinez. We just moved into the neighborhood over on Hillside Court. My realtor told us about your alpaca farm and said you sometimes give tours. My kids have been begging to see the alpacas since we heard about them." I smiled at the 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both probably under 10. "I'd be happy to show you around. Come on through the gate." I spent the next half hour introducing the Martinez family to all 8 of my alpacas, explaining about fiber production, letting the kids carefully touch the soft fleeces, and showing them how I processed the fiber after shearing. The kids were enthralled, and the parents asked thoughtful questions about the business side of things. As they were leaving, Jason paused. "This is exactly why we wanted to move here. We wanted space, and we wanted our kids to be around animals and agriculture, not just concrete and shopping malls. Thanks for fighting to keep this." After they left, I stood in my pasture, surrounded by my alpacas, and thought about how far I'd come since that morning when I'd found the first violation notice on my fence post. I'd been angry then, frightened about losing everything I'd built. I'd faced down an organization that thought it had the power to force me out, and I'd won not just for myself, but for the principle that property owners have rights that can't be trampled by petty tyrants with clipboards and covenants. The alpacas grazed peacefully around me, oblivious to the battles that had been fought over their right to exist on this property. Rembrandt lifted his head and made that soft humming sound that alpacas make when they're content, and the others echoed it in a gentle chorus. The sound drifted across the pasture, carried by the warm summer breeze that rustled through the cottonwoods along the property line. This was home. This was my livelihood. This was what I'd fought for and won. The autumn brought cooler temperatures and changing leaves, painting the foothills in golds and reds. My fiber business continued to thrive, and I found myself getting more involved in the local agricultural community. I joined the Larimer County Fiber Arts Coalition and started attending meetings where farmers, ranchers, and fiber producers discussed issues affecting our industry. Several other members had dealt with HOA problems similar to mine, and my successful legal battle had given others hope that they could stand up to unreasonable restrictions. I was invited to speak at a county agricultural commission meeting about right-to-farm protections and the challenges of operating agricultural businesses in areas with residential development. Standing at the podium in front of commissioners and fellow farmers, I told my story and emphasized the importance of clear zoning regulations and legal protections for legitimate agricultural operations. "The issue isn't just about my alpacas or someone else's chickens," I said. "It's about whether we as a society value agricultural land use and local food and fiber production, or whether we're going to let suburban sprawl completely eliminate these operations. Colorado has strong agricultural heritage, and that heritage doesn't disappear just because homes get built on neighboring lots. The right to farm laws exist for a reason, and local governments need to support those laws when they're challenged by HOAs that don't understand their limitations." The commission chair thanked me for my testimony and mentioned that they were considering new guidelines for how HOAs and agricultural operations should coexist. It felt good to be part of a larger conversation, to know that my fight had meaning beyond just my own property. Back at home, life settled into comfortable rhythms. Fall shearing season came, and I harvested the year's second fleeces from my alpacas. Though fall fiber was typically not quite as high quality as spring growth, I still found eager buyers for it, and the income helped offset winter feed costs. I spent long evenings in my processing room, skirting fleeces under good lighting, sorting fiber by quality and color, washing and preparing it for shipping to my clients. The work was meditative, hands moving through soft fiber, while my mind wandered or settled into quiet contentment. This was what I'd imagined when I first conceived of buying property and starting a fiber farm: peaceful, productive work that connected me to the land and to ancient traditions of animal husbandry and fiber arts. The legal battle with the HOA had been a nightmare, but surviving it had only reinforced my commitment to this life. Winter came, and with it, the slower season when the alpacas grew their thick coats and I focused on maintenance work and business planning for the coming year. I insulated the barn better and installed heated water buckets so the animals would have access to unfrozen water during cold snaps. I rebuilt one section of fence that was getting weathered and reinforced the gate latches. I updated my business website and started a blog where I shared photos of the alpacas and stories about life on the farm. The blog attracted more attention than I'd expected. People were hungry for this kind of content, glimpses into agricultural life that felt authentic and accessible. My follower count grew, and I started getting messages from people asking about buying fiber, visiting the farm, or even starting their own alpaca operations. I answered questions, shared resources, and occasionally arranged farm visits for people who were seriously interested in learning about alpacas. One visitor that winter was a young woman named Hannah, who was considering buying alpacas for her own property in nearby Wellington. She spent an entire Saturday afternoon with me, asking detailed questions about everything from fencing requirements to veterinary care to market opportunities for fiber. As she was leaving, she paused at her car. "Can I ask you something personal? How did you deal with the HOA situation emotionally? I mean, that must have been incredibly stressful." I thought about her question. It was one of the hardest things I've been through, honestly. There were nights I couldn't sleep, days when I was so angry I could barely function. The worst part wasn't the legal fight itself, but the feeling of being attacked for something I'd done completely legitimately. I'd followed all the rules, done everything right, and still someone was trying to destroy what I'd built. So how did you get through it? Partly just stubbornness. I knew I was right and I wasn't going to let them win, but also I had good legal help and a clear understanding of what I was fighting for. It wasn't just about the alpacas. It was about the principle that property rights mean something, and the people in power can't just abuse that power because they don't like something. Once I framed it that way in my mind, it became less about my personal stress and more about standing up for something important. Hannah nodded thoughtfully. "I hope I don't have to go through something like that, but if I do, I hope I can be as strong as you were." After she left, I thought about that conversation for a long time. Had I been strong? Maybe. Or maybe I'd just been too stubborn to give up, too invested in my dream to let it go without a fight. Either way, the outcome was the same. I'd survived, and I was still here, doing what I loved. Spring returned, and with it came the renewal that Colorado springs always brought. The pastures greened up, the alpacas shed their heavy winter coats, and I prepared for the busiest time of my business year. Shearing was scheduled for April 15th, and I'd lined up the same professional shearer I'd used the previous year. My order book was full, with commitments totaling nearly $23,000 for the year's fiber, a significant jump from previous years. The shearing went smoothly, a long day of controlled chaos as we worked through all 8 alpacas. The fiber quality was outstanding, and I spent the following weeks processing it for shipment to my clients. Each batch was carefully washed, dried, picked clean of any vegetation or debris, and packaged with labels showing the individual alpaca's name, color, and fiber statistics. My clients appreciated that level of detail and transparency, and several had told me it was one reason they preferred buying from small farms rather than large commercial operations. I was packaging the last shipment one afternoon when Marcus Foster stopped by again. We'd become casual friends over the past year, united by our shared experience of watching Deborah Patterson's reign and its aftermath. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Sure, come on in. Want some coffee?" We sat at my kitchen table, mugs in hand. Marcus looked tired but content. "I wanted to thank you again. The HOA is in such a better place than it was a year ago. We're actually doing what we're supposed to do now, maintaining common areas and enforcing reasonable standards instead of fighting stupid battles with residents." "I'm glad it worked out. How's the chicken operation going?" He grinned. "Great. We're getting about a dozen eggs a day. My daughter has taken over most of the care, and it's been amazing watching her learn responsibility and develop a connection with the animals. We never would have done it if you hadn't fought for the right to have agricultural operations here." "That's what makes communities strong," I said. "People being able to pursue their interests and passions without unnecessary restrictions. Within reason, obviously. But HOAs too often go way beyond reason." Marcus nodded. "I've been thinking about that a lot. I'm actually considering running for county commissioner next election. I think there's a need for people who understand both property rights and community governance, who can bridge those interests instead of just picking sides. You'd be good at that." After he left, I returned to my packaging, but my mind stayed on the conversation. It was interesting how one conflict could ripple outward, changing not just the immediate situation, but inspiring broader changes. Deborah Patterson's overreach had ultimately led to a better HOA, stronger protections for agricultural operations, and now potentially a new voice in county government. Unintended consequences flowing from one stubborn decision to fight rather than surrender. Summer rolled around again, marking a full year since the settlement. My business continued growing, and I found myself considering further expansion. The property could comfortably support a dozen alpacas, and the market demand was certainly there. I started researching breeding programs, thinking about whether I wanted to move from just fiber production into also selling breeding stock. It was a big decision, requiring different facilities and expertise, but it was exciting to contemplate. The farm was evolving, and I was evolving with it, learning and growing and discovering new possibilities. This was what I'd hoped for when I left my corporate IT job 3 years ago, this sense of building something meaningful with my own hands and vision. The neighborhood had evolved too. Several other properties now had small agricultural operations, chickens, goats, a couple of beehives, extensive vegetable gardens that supplied their families and neighbors. There was a different feel to the place now, less sterile and suburban, more alive and productive. People waved to each other, stopped to chat, shared surplus eggs or vegetables or jars of honey. It was becoming an actual community rather than just a collection of houses. One evening in July, I stood at my fence watching the sunset paint the mountains while my alpacas grazed in the cooling air. I thought about that morning over a year ago when I'd found the violation notice and felt my world tilting into chaos. I thought about the stress and anger and fear that had followed, the legal battles and the harassment and the uncertainty about whether I'd be able to keep what I'd built. All of that seemed distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. I'd come through it stronger, more confident in my rights and my ability to stand up for myself. The farm was thriving, the community was better, and I had a future full of possibilities stretching out ahead of me. Rembrandt came over to the fence and huffed at me, his breath warm and grassy sweet. I scratched behind his ears, feeling the dense softness of his fiber growing in. In a few months, I'd shear him again, starting another cycle of production and sales and growth. The seasons would turn, the work would continue, and I'd be here doing what I loved on land I owned, protected by laws that recognized my right to agricultural pursuit. That was worth fighting for. That was worth all the stress and struggle. And standing there in the golden evening light with my alpacas around me and my mountains rising in the distance, I knew without any doubt that I'd made the right choice to stand and fight rather than give in to unreasonable demands. The HOA had ordered my alpacas gone, but the fiber farm exemption and Colorado's right to farm laws had protected my operation, and in the end, it was the HOA that owed me damages, not the other way around. Justice had prevailed, not just in the legal sense, but in the broader sense of right overcoming wrong, of individual rights being protected against institutional overreach. My phone buzzed with an email notification. Another client inquiry, this one from a yarn shop in Vermont asking about purchasing fiber for their luxury line. I smiled and made a mental note to respond in the morning. The business kept growing, the opportunities kept expanding, and the future kept getting brighter. This was my life now, the one I'd fought to protect and preserve. And every day I woke up grateful that I'd had the courage to stand up when it mattered, to fight when it would have been easier to give up, to defend my rights and my property and my dreams against those who thought they had the power to take them away. The alpacas hummed their evening song, content and peaceful in their pasture. The sun slipped behind the mountains, leaving the sky streaked with purple and pink, and I stood there in the gathering twilight, at peace with my choices and confident in my future, knowing that I'd weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side.